Today we're going to build garage storage shelves that are cheaper and stronger than what you can get at the store.
This project only takes 12 2x4s and a sheet of OSB, which together should be about $60 depending upon your location. You can scale these to the length and depth that you need to fit your space. I started with a stack of 8 2x4s for the shelves and I marked them to size. Now this setup is going to be 6 feet long and 16 inches deep, which gives you the most shelving for the lowest cost. I used some scrap wood to elevate the boards off of the stack and support them during the cutting. I clamped together 2 2x4s and I cut them at the same time to speed things up. Using a carpenter square as a guide for the circular saw helps you cut straight along your line, but it won't prevent kickback. Yes, on my first cut of the project, I already ran into an issue, but this is going to be a good teaching moment because you could run into this as well. Now, everything was going fine and I didn't tilt or move the saw off of square, but it grabbed the wood and kicked back like an angry mule anyway. Now, it's a scary thing when it happens. Just immediately let your finger off the trigger and keep hold of the saw. I moved the first piece away and I finished the cut on that second board. And when I looked at it, I noticed that the one that had bound up had a decent twist in it. And the support blocks were a little too far apart, and I think that let the board rock while I was cutting it, which likely caused it to pinch, and that caused the kickback. So for the rest of the cuts, I moved those supports in a lot closer, and I didn't have any more issues. If you've got any good tips for reducing kickback, go ahead and share them below in the comments for everyone to read.
You can cut your 2x4s to size with the circular saw just like I showed, though you might run into a little bit of binding issues at times, so just be careful with that. But a much better option is the miter saw. So if you've been thinking about upgrading to a miter saw, I would highly recommend it. So when you're cutting these smaller 13-inch boards, it really comes in handy. Also, the finish on it is going to be a lot better than on your circular saw.
Now the long shelf boards are connected with 13-inch bracing, and this is a perfect place to use a stop block. I set the stop block at 23 inches and I used a 10-inch spacer to get it down to 13 because my stop block is limited to 15 inches due to the miter saw fence. I cut braces for each shelf and then I moved on to cutting the material for the top of the shelves. Now I actually had some similar shelves that I made out of 2x3 material, but they were too long and they sagged a little under heavy weight. So I unloaded them and gave them to a neighbor to make room for this new set.
Here's a little project that I've forgotten about, and it is nice and rusty now. We'll take care of that later.
And next I brought over the sheet material and I set it on the 2x4s, which I'll be using for the legs. And this makes a great support base for cutting things down.
For the actual surface of the shelves, I'm going to be using this oriented strand board. This is 7/16 thick. This sheet is only about $10, so it's very inexpensive, and it's going to hold up just fine because the distance on the top shelf is going to be very narrow. It doesn't need a lot of support.
I cut 16-inch strips from the sheet, and if you're a pro with a circular saw and you can cut a straight 8-foot line by freehand, then you've got me beat. I need a little help, and you can use something like this Craig Rip Cut as a guide, but you really don't even need that. You don't have to have a fancy jig or guide to make this cut. Just measure the distance between the edge of your circular saw and the blade. Mine here is 1.5 inches on the short side. And then you can find a straight 2x4. Let me rephrase that. If you can find a straight 2x4, which somehow I was able to, then you can clamp it down 1.5 inches in from the cut line that you want, and then ride the saw against that board for a straight cut. And making the shelf 16 inches deep, let me get 3 8-foot strips out of the 4x8 sheet. And next, I cut each strip down in length to match the 2x4s that I had cut earlier for the shelves that were 69 inches. I used some of the bracing parts to support the offcut and another one clamped down as a guide here. And yes, I realized that I should probably be able to cut a 16-inch line straight by hand, but I'm still a recovering engineer and I have a straight edge to run against. It just makes me feel warm and all mathematical inside. Now also after this, I could use the offcuts to get 3 23-inch pieces to cover the 4th shelf. And that means the only waste from this full sheet of OSB are these tiny pieces that I'm throwing off here to the side. And that really makes me happy. So next up, I can start in on assembly.
And when you're assembling the shelves, you're probably going to have to do it on your garage floor. My benches are not big enough to do these shelves. So if you do, make sure you're looking for a flat spot in your garage. The floors in garages are notorious for being nice and wavy. So if you look at mine, I have actually a big dip right here. And I know that that happens. But if I move it back towards my cabinet, it's a lot flatter. So I'm actually going to assemble back here in the back. If you can find a flat part or a flat-ish part of your garage, assembly is going to go a lot smoother.
I laid out the long shelf boards and I marked in 23 inches from each side to locate the inner braces. I decided to use 4 braces on each shelf, which is honestly overkill, but these things will not sag at all for sure. I'm using 2.5-inch number 10 screws here to attach everything. And the screws that I'm using are self-tapping, so you don't need to drill pilot holes. But if you do want to play it safe, or if you're using regular screws, then make sure you do pre-drill at least the ends so that they won't split. Then I centered the inner braces on the marks that I had made, and I screwed them in place as well and moved on to the next shelf.
One thing to look for on these is you want to check the crown. The crown is basically which way the board is humping, if it's going to be up on top or on the bottom. And so this one, it kind of curves this way. So I'm going to put this facing up. Just make sure that each of them have it going the same way. Because if one board is humping up and the other one's humping down, it's going to be kind of weird to get it assembled.
I got to putting together the other shelves, but I had a little side project going with the help of today's sponsor, WD-40.
So here's a part from that mortiser that I had under the shelves, and it is nice and rusty. It's been sitting there for a lot of years. So while I'm doing the build, I'm gonna put this in a little cup of rust remover. I'm gonna use the WD-40 Specialist Rust Remover Soak and see how much of this rust it takes off.
But to finish up the shelves, I added the OSB sheathing to the tops. I started with the upper shelf and I laid out the 3 small panels that I cut and I attached them to the 2x4s with some me-nails. But if your name isn't Brad, you could also use screws. And when I switched over to the long pieces, I seemed a little less clever.
All right, minor issue here. I actually was trying to get a little too precise when I cut these tops, and there's an overhang on the end. It's about 1/16 of an inch, but it's gonna hold off the leg because the legs go on the ends. When you're cutting these tops, cut them slightly undersized so you're not gonna run into this issue, because a little gap at the edges doesn't really matter because you get a round over on the end anyway. Don't be like me. Don't try to fit it too tight. Just give yourself a little bit of wiggle room.
And while I'm cutting these ends off, let's check out how that WD-40 Rust Remover Soak worked. Now, after just an hour, it had taken off all that surface rust with no scrubbing at all. I've got to say, I am impressed. It's non-toxic and it's biodegradable, which makes it easy to work with too. Now check the link below for socially distant purchase options for Walmart, including delivery as well as contact-free checkout and pickup, so you can stay safe and healthy during these times. Thanks, WD-40. After I got all the shelves put together, I moved on to the legs. I cut the left side legs down to 75.5 inches, and then I checked the slope of my garage floor for the length of the right legs.
If you're gonna be installing this at the back of your garage, you won't have to go through this step. But if you are going on a sidewall, you need to account for the slope. You can always shim it, but it's easier just to cut the legs the size that you need in the first place. So I'm gonna use this 2x4, which is 75.5 inches, to tell me how much slope I have across that distance. I'm using some 1/4-inch plywood just as shims to shim it up until the bubble gets level.
Now it ended up being just under a 1/2-inch drop over that distance, so I cut the right side legs to just under 76 inches, and then I started assembling the unit. Now since the top shelf is flush with the legs, it's easiest to assemble the shelves upside down starting from the top. I squared up the left side legs, making sure that I kept the orientation of the shelving unit in mind, and then I put the short legs on the correct end. And then I secured each leg with 3 screws, and I did the same on the other end. You're still going to be able to adjust these quite a bit before attaching the next shelf, so don't worry if they're slightly off here. Now to space the shelves consistently and making one-person assembly a bit easier, I cut 15-inch spacers from the offcuts of the legs. I put a spacer on each corner and I brought over the next shelf, and I could lay that right down on those spacer blocks and support everything. Now at this point, I spent a little time getting everything lined up, square and flush. So checking the distance between where I did the first shelf and this one, made sure that everything was nice and square, and that if anything was out, I could change it then. And after putting 1 screw in each leg and getting everything in place, I went back and I added 2 more screws for 3 screws in every corner. Now the other 2 shelves go in just like this one, and one thing to look for here though is if you have any twisted shelves where a corner stands up versus the others, just make sure that you're pulling down each corner flush to those spacer blocks before you secure them in place. If you want to build this, I do have plans available with the cut list. It's going to make it nice and easy for you. Just check the link down below in the description. And after attaching that last shelf, I got in my daily workout by lifting this beast up and admiring the storage. I enlisted help from my wife Susan, and we walked the unit into place over on the wall. But there was one more thing to deal with before attaching it.
A lot of garages are going to have this curb that sticks out past the drywall, and you're going to have to deal with that. So what I'm going to do is take the back leg and I'm going to cut it down so that it will fit right on top of this curb. And if you have a curb that goes the whole way, you can do that on both of the back legs. The curb actually stops right before the end of the garage shelves over here, so I don't need to cut that back one on the other side. So I'm just going to mark it, then flip it over, cut it, and then we can put it in place and attach it to the studs.
We turned the shelving around and we flipped it over to cut the back leg. And moving this thing and looking at each other face to face seemed like some kind of couple's game show challenge. And I cut off the back leg with my circular saw, which was a little bit awkward, but it worked out. Then before standing it back up, I used a magnet to find the screws in the drywall. And this showed me where the studs are going to be, and then I marked it with blue tape so I could attach the shelves there. Now we moved the shelves into place and I put that back leg on top of the curb, and then I secured the shelving into the studs with 3-inch screws. And as any experienced parent knows, I thought about what I didn't want my kids to be doing, and I did that to make sure it wouldn't fall over. We reorganized the items on the shelves, and we got some new bins that we're going to be putting labels on later to make it easy to identify them. And the nice thing is you can fit 3 bins here on the low profile, and nothing will be sticking out. But if you don't mind them sticking over the edge a little bit, you can actually fit 4 of them wide, and this gives you a lot of storage options.
I've got some more garage organization ideas like how I built these cabinets. I've got a video right over there that'll show you exactly how I did that. So I'll see you over there. We're going to build something awesome.